GEM International is a new diamond explorer in the richest diamond-producing country in Africa, located next to the fourth largest producing diamond mine in the world. International Spotlight is on an 1109-carat diamond recently discovered in Africa by a fellow Canadian junior with a proven operator and finance team. GEM International trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol GI. Visit us at gemdiamondmining.com.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan, where he has worked and lived since 2004. Welcome back to our show, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you. I'm looking forward to a Happy New Year as well. Let's hope.
Do they do much for Christmas in Japan?
Christmas is not so much of a holiday here. There is a commercial aspect to it. They have picked up on that, and it's actually seen more as a date night. Christmas Eve is a date night for couples more so than anything else, but there you go.
Well, we'll see what Santa has in their stockings the next day. The Bank of Japan just held its quarterly meeting. Did anything come out of it?
Nothing of significance came directly out of the meeting. In fact, other than a raising of the economic outlook by the Ministry of Finance. But, interestingly, just days later, the government has announced that they are going to slash their 2017 bond issue. In fact, they're only planning to issue 154 trillion yen in Japanese government bonds in the coming fiscal year, which is down 5% from the initial 162.2 trillion that they planned for the previous fiscal year. So that's interesting, and in effect, this is an implicit boost to quantitative easing. So I think it shows that once again the Japanese government is assuming that things are improving from here, but I think reality might find a way of intervening.
And just how much money would I make if I bought a Japanese government bond?
I don't have the current the current rate in front of me, but it is a minuscule amount, if anything at all. It's extremely low, and in fact, of course, the Bank of Japan has recently committed to maintaining a 0% on the 10-year. So Japanese government bonds are not exactly an investment unless you're basically looking to not gain but not lose any money in an environment where I guess you're expecting to lose something.
Exactly, but it's certainly not very attractive. And of course, in Europe, they have negative bonds. That can't be much fun.
No, paying for the privilege of holding someone's debt. It's kind of a strange phenomenon, but that's the world that we're living in. And apparently the Federal Reserve thinks things are going in the exact opposite direction for the United States, and we'll see what the higher target rate for the Fed funds rate will bring about within the new year.
Well, how has Japan's zero interest rate worked out?
Pretty abysmally so far, and in fact, it's driven at least one of the major market maker banks out of the market here. One of the major banks announced earlier this year that they were going to get out of the market making for Japanese government bonds because there's just no money to be made in it, and clearly less people are interested in holding Japanese government debt that is at such anemically low interest rates, and that's one of the reasons why the Japanese government is planning to issue less of it this year. Less buyers that are scrambling for it means that less that they can get away with issuing.
What's the view on India's war against cash and gold jewelry?
Well, that's continuing to play out in a long game, and I think the recent demonetization of the rupee has to be seen within the context of that long game as one sign, of course, that the government is always looking at ways of cracking down on anything that goes outside of their system. And as we know, the ultimate system in terms of the perspective of the would-be controllers of the economy is a cashless one in which every transaction is identified and identifiable and can be traced directly to you. So I think it's no surprise that that's where not only India but most of the world is going. And one of the corollaries of that is there have been various attempts at cracking down in one way or another on gold purchases in India. But that's, I think, going to be a particularly tough nut to crack in a culture that has been historically very much wedded to their gold.
10,000 years of history, I think.
At least, yes, and certainly still going strong, and it's still, of course, absolutely very much a part of the culture, including with the dowry system and all of that. So, again, I don't think that's going to change overnight, but it's certainly something that the government's working on, and moves towards the cashless society are advancing apace not only in India but around the world.
Well, with India's bureaucracy, they'll be successful in, 100, 200 years?
Well, I'm sure they'll try to implement it much before the point at which they actually can. Very much like this demonetization of the rupee, which they announced in a dramatic speech by the Prime Minister on live TV, saying that as of midnight tonight, these notes will not be redeemable as currency anymore. And they had told the printers that were printing the new notes that were intended to replace these notes that they would have until the new year to print those notes. But then they were the ones who found out during this live presentation as well that, no, this is all going to happen at midnight. So they were scrambling to try to fulfill the orders. And so it has turned into the usual type of Indian bureaucratic nightmare. And one can imagine how much worse that will be when and if they ever do actually move towards a fully cashless society.
But of course, countries around the world are doing that. In Europe, you can only take out a certain amount of money from an ATM every day, or maybe per week. And of course, the Italian banking crisis, something like a 20 billion euro bailout plan has been announced, but we don't know yet if that's going to involve shaving people's bank accounts. Any fears of that happening in Japan or China?
There hasn't been talk of that at this point, but certainly I think all eyes are on Italy at the moment, and of course the Italian banking system there, and with the latest news being that Italy is planning to nationalize Monte Paschi after a private sector rescue has failed. So there is some big moves afoot going on in the Italian banking sector in particular, and as I think people know by now, certainly in Europe, but really globally, these types of banking failures are very seldom contained to just one tiny market. It's generally whatever is happening in somewhere like Italy will very soon spread to other banks that are teetering in other parts, and whatever happens as a result of that can be a precedent-setting event, as we saw, for example, with the Greek bailouts and all of the brouhaha around that. That can set a sort of warning for other states that are in the same or a similar predicament. So I think all eyes are on what's going to happen with Monte Paschi right now, and ultimately what's going to come of this.
Well, I know in Europe the Germans insisted on austerity measures in Greece, but those very measures are going to make it very hard for the Greeks to pay that debt back.
It is, and has been argued as such since the point at which it was negotiated. Has been argued it's unsustainable, a burden that's being placed on Greece, and I think that certainly seems to be the case because, of course, we know that the more you try to increase taxes, for example, in an economy, the more that's going to strangle the economy and basically shut down the economic activity that would lead to those taxes. I think it's that type of catch-22 situation where the more tightly you attempt to squeeze this particular grape, the less juice you're actually going to get out of it. So it is an almost insoluble position, certainly from the perspective of the EU Troika or whatever they're calling themselves these days, because they don't want a country like Greece to get away with it, but they want to make sure that Greece can actually survive whatever they're imposing on it, which is a difficult tightrope to walk. And of course, it comfortably circumvents the entire question of whether this is an odious debt in the first place, which is what a lot of people have been arguing, and which was the reason that Syriza was voted into office in the first place, but of course so notably turned directly against the wishes of its own electorate.
A Chinese billionaire has complained to the National Post in Canada that the tax imposed on foreign buyers for Vancouver real estate, 15%, is in some way unfair, and they just don't understand why they would do that, why their money wouldn't be welcome.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. I suppose maybe it would be more welcome if it was actually doing something in the economy other than sparking or at least fueling rising housing prices and making it basically impossible for the average person to afford a good home in Vancouver. But yes, generally this money is just being moved in and parked in these properties that are then essentially abandoned and worn down and are doing absolutely nothing productive. So it doesn't surprise me at all that the government would attempt to get something out of this and hopefully, if not prevent the stem of Chinese money flowing into the country, at least do something that will get the government's claws into it. I certainly understand why they would do that.
Meanwhile, in Toronto, their real estate boom continues, and yes, foreign money is a big part of that, and they have no intention of stopping it. They're glad to see that money come from, go to Toronto instead of Vancouver.
I suppose that's one way of looking at it, but again, I don't think it's doing a lot of productive things in that economy, at least not at this point. It's just sitting in these properties and inflating housing prices, which is, I suppose, good in a certain sense in the short term, but we all know how those types of housing bubbles tend to end, and spoiler alert, it doesn't end very well for anyone.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after the break.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, is China increasingly trying to tighten currency controls?
Well, it has been attempting to do so for a number of years now, and I think there's a bit more urgency to it at this point because certainly the growing, rising dragon that we saw in the first decade of this millennia is not a rising dragon at this point anymore. They are still proclaiming that they are getting 6.7% annual growth. That's what they've claimed for the last 3 quarters. And guess what estimate the economists are converging at for the next quarter? Yes, 6.7% on the bottom. So they're still continuing to hold the line that they're growing at a moderately good clip. But I think the reality is quite different from that. And they've been attempting to deleverage and try to eat away at the massive amounts of debt that have been fueling this bubble in the last several years, but I don't think they've been very successful at that. They've basically restructured some things to make it somewhat more sustainable, but there's still total debt is likely to hit 300% of GDP in 2017, which of course is a massive amount. So I think there are some structural problems that the Chinese government is looking to crack as the global trade situation is continuing to slow down, as they are facing a Trump presidency that looks more and more like it's aiming its guns, metaphorical or otherwise, in China's direction. All things are looking fairly negative for the Chinese economy, and at the same time they're trying to wrench the gears around from an export-based economy to one that is somewhat more dependent on domestic activity. And so a large part of that is predicated on trying to stem the capital outflows. And it's very difficult to do because it's like a beach ball. Wherever you push it down underwater, there's going to be another way that it'll pop back up as soon as it finds a way. And in fact, one of the ways that apparently Chinese capital is getting out, or at least the Chinese government is now looking at, is Bitcoin, which we have seen rising quite remarkably in the past few months. Directly in line with some of these Chinese capital controls. And in fact, there's an interesting plot that you can do of Bitcoin in U.S. dollars versus the U.S. dollar to Chinese yuan exchange rate, and that map plots almost exactly over the past year and a half. It's quite uncanny. So I think there's more and more creative ways that Chinese are finding to get their money out of the country.
Well, Bitcoin just hit $800 US for the first time, I think, in about 3 years. So Bitcoin, it seems to be doing booming business. They did have that major hack that disappeared about $100 million worth of value, but people must trust it if it's worth that much money now. It started off, by the way, I think around 25 cents.
Yes, it was in the pennies, I believe, when it began. But you're right. I mean, I think when people talk about Bitcoin being hacked, I think that's one of the problems of Bitcoin. It's obviously difficult for people who are not technologically inclined to understand how it works and what it is. and the fact that Bitcoin itself can't be hacked. That would be like saying that the U.S. dollar was hacked, per se. But the certain exchanges have certainly had problems, and that's created PR black eyes. But I think the people who are very much motivated to get their money out of the country, or at least into other assets, generally find cryptocurrencies when they're looking for it, which is exactly why, for example, Bitcoin has been booming in Venezuela, exactly as Venezuela is turning into, the Venezuelan currency is turning into toilet paper. This is generally what happens. And China is now looking at ways of cracking down on Bitcoin exchanges to make sure that they do not cooperate with international exchanges so that people cannot get their Bitcoin out of the country, so to speak. So they're attempting to close a barn door long after I'm sure a lot of money has already flowed out of it.
Well, that's the case too. In Europe, all the rich people got their money out of Cyprus before people had their bank accounts dipped into to bail out the banks. And I'm sure in Italy, all the billionaires have carefully stashed their money someplace else. In Panama, probably.
Generally. Well, yes, and in fact, that's an interesting observation. I just recorded an episode of my New World Next Week series where we talk about 3 stories every week on YouTube, and this was the year-end wrap-up, and I chose as my story of the year the Panama Papers story because most people probably have forgotten about it. But at the time, I noted that story was to a large extent, I think, about the PR around the idea of the tax evasion as part of a consolidation of political capital and political will around closing these tax loopholes and getting these tax evaders. In fact, that was exactly what Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, said at the time. These Panama Papers are not surprising, but they help us, i.e. help us to crack down on this horrible epidemic. And I noted that more cynically in the context of the creation of the global taxation grid at the OECD level and some agreements that they'd been working on to try to basically get everyone's individual bank account details, not just the big billionaire fat cats, but every single individual's into a giant grid that's being shared among 107 countries now. Panama had been a significant holdout on that at that time, and had even been noted in The Economist just months before the Panama Papers as an international pariah that had to be dealt with. And then after the Panama Papers, lo and behold, October 27th of this year, guess who joined into that OECD agreement to share all all bank account data down to the individual level with all of the other signatories of that agreement? It was Panama. So there was the denouement of the story of 2016.
Well, here in BC, the Taxpayers Federation did their annual naughty and nice list, and they said we should thank Irv LaRue of Prince George. For 20 years, he fought the Canadian Revenue Agency. They were going after his recreational vehicle park, and he won his case after 20 years. Now, apparently, the Canadian Taxation Authority has to treat its so-called clients with respect. Can you imagine?
I can't even imagine what that would entail, but I'd be excited to find out.
Japan has decided to close its fast breeder reactor. Do you have anything more on that?
I don't. I know that there has been, certainly in the wake of Fukushima, as you would expect, there has been mass popular movements against the nuclear industry here. But that has not translated into much, if any, political changes whatsoever. In fact, what we've seen consistently through 2 different governments and 2 different sides of the political aisle here has been, if anything, a headlong rush to get those reactors all back online and operating again. So I haven't heard about the breeder reactor specifically being shut down, but if so, it represents perhaps a small political victory for the sizable anti-nuclear lobby here.
Fukushima, is it still turning sushi to yakitori?
Well, I guess that depends on who you're asking and in what context, but certainly it is still an ongoing problem, and still the groundwater flowing into the Pacific is a concern, obviously, and still the core of the problem, to excuse the pun, still exists. The 3 melted down cores in reactors 1, 2, and 3 still are there, and still we don't really know exactly where or how they're lying because no one can get near them. And that's not a problem that's going to be covered up anytime in the near future. So that is still happening. But as to what this means, for example, recently there was tests coming from the western United States off the coast that were proving, I believe, cesium-134, which has to be a sign of Fukushima. That was the only event that could have possibly produced it. So that is showing up demonstrably and detectably on the west coast of the United States, but in levels that people would say would be equivalent to about 1/100th of a dental X-ray. So nothing whatsoever to worry about from a human health perspective. And again, that will be a proclamation that will be disputed by others. So again, I think it depends on what experts you're listening to. But at any rate, the actual problem itself certainly is not over.
And one of my favorite stories about how China deals with the media, last Friday, China was accused of stealing a U.S. Navy underwater drone in the South China Sea. On Monday, China issued a statement saying it is completely inaccurate to say that we stole the U.S. Navy drone. Then on Monday, they announced we have returned the drone that we did not steal.
Yes, it's an interesting story because it reveals so much about the South China Sea situation and what's happening there. For people who don't know, this was an unmanned underwater vehicle that the U.S. Navy had stationed 50 nautical miles off the coast of the Philippines, which certainly would be in that 200-mile exclusionary zone that all nations claim around their territory. But China declares that as being part of its claim to the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, which contains an awful lot of space. And so they were saying that this was within their ambit. The U.S. was saying it was in international waters. At any rate, it was a military drone that was collecting military oceanographic data, and the Chinese say that they removed it because it was a threat to shipping in the region. Take that for what it is. But they did return it after having examined the drone, and so that, at least that particular issue is done and over. But I think we all understand that this is really just a sign of things to come, especially in the Trump administration, especially because Trump just appointed Peter Navarro to head his National Trade Council in the White House, which is going to look at how to oversee industrial policy. And Peter Navarro, perhaps best known for writing books with titles such as Death by China and Crouching Tiger, What China's Militarism Means for the World, I think it's quite clear that there were certain elements within the U.S. Political establishment that was looking at Cold War 2.0 with Russia. I think Trump much more sees something coming with China, and I think that might be the story of the coming years. So this drone issue was a minor tempest in a teapot in terms of what it actually was, but in terms of what it portends for the future, I think it's extremely, actually quite important and quite worrisome for people living in the region at the very least.
Yes, and Trump, by taking a phone call from the president of Taiwan, had no idea, or at least he said, he had no idea it would cause such a fuss in China.
I actually tend to believe that, if only because I doubt that he has enough foreign policy expertise to understand the implications of that. But at any rate, I'm sure he doesn't mind poking an eye in the Beijing, poking a finger in Beijing government's eye when and if he can. So at any rate, even if it was for just happenstance, it was fortuitous happenstance, I'm sure, from his perspective.
Well, I'm pretty sure Trump knows where every one of his hotels and golf courses is, but he doesn't really understand the difference between countries, say, in Great Britain. What's the difference between Scotland, Wales, and England? He has no idea. He was asked about Brexit when he was opening a new golf course. He had no idea what Brexit was.
It's going to be a very interesting year in the year ahead, and I'm sure we'll just have to be here scooping things up in the wake of whatever's coming.
James, you and your family have a great Christmas and a Happy New Year.
My best to you and yours.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He was speaking to us from Japan. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Best of the holidays.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.